Bonjour, merci. Je suis
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning, and I'd like to thank the members of the committee for having thought to invite me. I'm speaking on behalf of Indigenous groups, so I'd like to thank you on their behalf. And I'll try to calm down, but it's rare that I speak in such of a big audience. I'm rather stressed, but I'm sure that I'll get up to cruising speed soon. I'm going to talk about social interventions with Indigenous communities, in particular families and children in Indigenous communities. I've divided this presentation into two parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about the different keys, because to intervene in this type of context, we have to know about these keys to the culture. So I'm going to talk about the family within its socio-historical context and also its contemporary historical and social context. And I'll talk in particular about the resilience of these families. Then secondly, I'm going to talk more about social interventions from a viewpoint of the different practitioners that I've interviewed. When I was dealing with this with my research projects, I've got various research projects with the Urashat, which is a small Indigenous community which is situated on the north shore of Sept-Îles, up in the north of Quebec. And then Washat is in Sept-Îles-Punario, is about 25 minutes north of that. And after that, I'll round off with giving you some possible ideas and solutions so we can look at the social interventions that are provided by non-Indigenous peoples who could be more sensitive to all of these issues. And I'm going to try and see how I can deal with all of this.
Ça marche? Ouais. Bon, avant d'entrer dans le vif du sujet, j'avais besoin de faire...
No. Just a few words of caution, if you like, at the outset, just some caveats. I really want to draw a distinction between intervening in a cultural context or an intercultural context on one hand, and then, on the other hand, intervening in an Indigenous setting. These are two completely separate fields. We can transpose what we find in cultural diversity into Indigenous social interventions, but you can't necessarily transpose everything into this other Indigenous context. And something that I teach to my students is that we don't say that we always need to know the historical social context of all the countries of origin when we're talking about immigrants with whom we're going to have interventions. But you'll see it is impossible to work in an Indigenous setting without having actually gained knowledge about the history of oppression of Indigenous peoples. Then secondly, they are not subject to this same laws. There's the Indian Act, whereas immigrants are subject to the immigrant law, which is a completely different one. I'm still finding it quite stressful, says the speaker. Normally it takes me 2 minutes for my heart to stop beating as fast. It's true, the speaker is speaking very fast for the interpreters as well. And the Indigenous people have specific rights which flow from treaties and ancestral rights which immigrants don't have when they arrive on our Canadian territory. And I'd also like to say that as non-Indigenous people, vis-a-vis Indigenous people, we have this obligation to repair things, which is a duty that we don't have vis-a-vis immigrants. So I think that's an important message to vehicle and convey to you right away. So I just need to come back to my previous slide for a moment. In Quebec, there are 11 Indigenous nations and 58 communities. They're all different. They all have their own specific histories, their specific values and ways of living. So what I'm going to talk about here doesn't actually apply to all of the different Indigenous communities. Perhaps some of them would like me to introduce some nuances in what I'm saying. I'm sharing my knowledge with you. And that's based on a great deal of research that I've carried out with the Inus up in Ouacha in Sept-Îles, in the north of Quebec. That was just to make that precise. When we're talking about Indigenous families, we cannot ignore all the years of oppression, the years of interventions by the state within their lives, because we still see the impact today. And Indigenous families still have to try and deal with all of these different impacts and repercussions. In terms of the different oppressive policies that have had a dramatic effect on these Indigenous families, I think that we know quite a bit about the residential schools issue. In Quebec, we've heard a great deal about that over the last few years. But something that we don't know so well is the scoop in the 1960s, when there was the gradual closing down of the residential schools around the 1950s. The Youth Protection Services stepped in, and the Youth Protection Services arrived in the communities, and that meant that they actually withdrew the children from the communities over 20 years in the 1960s right up until the 1980s. Social workers came in and actually massively withdrew thousands of children from their communities. In certain communities, they arrived with buses, and we filled up the buses and we took the children out of their communities. And when I talk about that with my students, they, Christian, that was 30 years ago. I think that we need to move on. Why are we still hammering on about this? And I respond to them that the problem is that today, still there's an overrepresentation of children being taken into care by the youth protection services when we're talking about Indigenous children, and there's still a significant number of children that are placed, for example, in foster homes, often outside their communities. There's a study, just to give you a few figures, which states that at the moment there's 12% Indigenous children would have 12 more chances of being placed in a substitute home or a foster home compared to a non-Indigenous child. They're 12 times more likely to be placed in a foster care setting. So that's quite a gloomy picture, but I don't want to just insist on the negative side of things in the communities. We have to remember that Indigenous families over the last few years and decades, they have not just been subject to all of these different oppressive policies and put up with them. As a result of my research, I can see that at the moment within Indigenous communities there are several processes underway where there's a cultural revitalisation going on and there's social healing, and their families are showing a great deal of resilience. They're affirming their identity and their specific characteristics. And even if Indigenous families are confronted with more significant social problems compared to us, it doesn't mean that they're not capable of actually dealing with this. The message that I'd like to get across here is that often, you have to realise there's two aspects here. You shouldn't just read this as a gap or as a deficit, which often comes up in literature. If you just take that reading of the situation, then you're hiding the fact that they have all of these coping mechanisms to deal with their socio-historical context. And we also have to debunk this myth, namely to believe that Indigenous families or Indigenous societies are necessarily going to develop in the same way as Quebec society as a whole. Even if in Indigenous families we use many modern means, when I've gone up to the communities, they've all got their refrigerator and their house, and they all take their ski-doo to go off hunting, but they've still got their values and their beliefs and cultural practices which are part of their life, especially their family life. And so if we could better get to know these cultural practices, which are social protective factors, quite simply, then we'd be able to draw on these strengths and mobilise them and deploy them in an appropriate way. So let's talk about the cultural practices in terms of the education and the bringing up of the children. I could talk about this for almost 3 hours, but in a few minutes I'll say that something that's extremely important to take away from this here is that education of the children fits into a complex parental family structure, which is difficult to understand as a non-Indigenous person when we don't live within one of these communities. But within this family lifestyle, the parents and the grandparents still have responsibilities and duties vis-a-vis their grandchildren, for example. In communities, children don't necessarily belong to the nuclear family as defined in Quebec. They belong to everyone, to all the members in the family, and perhaps even in the wider community. I've pushed it that far. So education is something that is shared by various individuals, not just by the mother or the father. And one of the cultural practices, I've carried out a study that deals with all of the different cultural practices that are present amongst Indigenous families. Could mention several, but one of them that's most important and which really gets across this idea of how they educate their children in a shared way is the cultural adoption or the cultural taking care of the children. It's a concept which is difficult for us to grasp, but that's the one that's used at the moment to get across this idea of what's happening in the communities. Historically, this practice of allowing the children to move around freely from one family to another, it was a practice that was there to ensure survival on the territory, because it meant that the Indigenous people had this vast network of shared knowledge. Now cultural adoption no longer has this function of ensuring survival on the territory, but nevertheless it still has this function of protecting and taking care of the children. And the Inuits will tell you that now this has become a very specific way of helping each other out. This maintains this important value in the Indigenous families, namely of helping one another. And so so the parents will hand over their children to a member of the family or their sister, their uncle, their grandparents for different reasons. They may do it, for example, because they have social problems or mental health issues, or because, for example, they have an addiction issue. But when we carried out our study, we realised that that wasn't necessarily the main reason why this type of cultural adoption would take place and why we'd hand over our child to someone else. Sometimes it's done in a temporary basis because we have to leave the community to go off and pursue our studies outside of the reserve or to go off for work purposes. But we've all seen that young girls have their first child quite early, around 15 or 16 years of age, and often they live with their mother or their grandparents, and there it's the grandparents or the sister who actually looks after the child and brings them up. And when the mother leaves the home for various reasons, the child has to make this choice to stay, for example, with their grandparents, will continue to live with their grandparents for the rest of their life as they grow up. So that's what I wanted to say about those particular aspects. As I've said, I could say a great deal about this, but I know that time's ticking. So in particular, I wanted to talk about this practice of social interventions. And the results that I'm presenting here are drawn from a study that was carried out amongst social practitioners that were all Innu. And one thing that came out of this study was that the work of these practitioners is different. It stands out because of the rhythm, their relationship to time, and also the aim or the purpose of the intervention. First of all, is concentrated on this moment in time, the relationship which is built up, and the support that has to be given to the other. They don't insist as much as us on the problem to be identified or any change objectives. That doesn't mean that they don't take account of the actual issue, but for them the problem is more of a pretext, if you like, for intervening rather than the point of departure. And here I've got two quotations which allow us to illustrate what I'm talking about. Sometimes Denise says, sometimes all we do is talk and talk and chat and chat. Sometimes it's not at all related to the reason for their visit. I say that sometimes we insist too much on the problem, and as we continue to tap in this nail, we have the risk of breaking what's around the nail, and sometimes what is around this is actually what is most precious. Or Nadine has said you have to go beyond this little bobo, this little injury. You shouldn't just insist on the problem. And drawing on this way of looking at the intervention, first of all, they'll go for interventions in an indirect way that are the least restrictive and the least intrusive as well. And here Nadine is saying Indigenous practitioners have much less confrontation than non-Indigenous practitioners. You shouldn't just have confrontation. It's never necessary. It's better to get to know people and their limits. Now she's Director of Youth Protection Services, but before she was a clinical supervisor and she was in a particular field of intervention. Nadine has also told us that what we need to do is to actually learn how to let go. And in this narrative that we developed for her, she said that letting go is an Innu skill that all Indigenous people have, and that we really needed to learn to work on letting go like them. So for her, this means in particular that you have to put trust in the individual in front of you, and also put trust in time, because often time is the great healer. And as she said at one point, in many cases it's a life that's made the difference, not the system. And they also say to you, if I had my new friends here up on the stage with me, they'd say that in order to intervene in an Indigenous setting, you have to in particular draw on humour and metaphors. You have to take time, a great deal of time. I don't have enough time to do it with you today, but you need to take as much time as possible to listen, first of all, and then explain, using simple images or specific tangible images. And here Jade said, we are people where it's our heart and images that count for us rather than thinking people and speaking people. We're much more visual and we don't speak as much. And Nadine once again said, I've often said that we need to use parables and images, because sometimes that's a better way of getting the message across, and humour really helps as well. And also practitioners will say something that's extremely important at the moment in communities is to deal with this identity malaise, which we see in particular amongst young people, the younger generation. And one of the main ways of doing this, there's several ways, is to really mobilise people on the territory, because the territory is one way of going back to their origins, the source of all of this. And I've got a quotation from Jean-Claude, because I perhaps need to explain this. He's saying that a young person today is like an arrow that is resting on the string. If you just let the arrow go like that, it will fall to the ground. But if we take this arrow and you pull it back, first of all, then of course the arrow is naturally going to move forward and go further. So on going to go back to your territory is going back to your origins, and it also means that we have to develop programs and services that ensure that we have this cultural security for young people in their communities. And that's almost the conclusion. There's a great deal that I could still say, but depending on the time that I've got a few takeaways to share with you here. As non-Indigenous people, if we really want to support the resilience process and the healing processes, at the same time we want to ensure that there's true protection for children, the protection of children's rights, their rights to live and grow up within their communities. And in order to do that, we have to first of all take account of this history of oppression that they've lived through, and we have to recognise that they're not just victims of the past, but they're also resilient actors in their history. We have to recognise the values and the cultural practices in the education of their children more or less work as protective factors. So we need to really draw on these further and further, and we also have to take time to listen to their way of doing things, which is different from ours. We have to recognise that they have different ways of bringing up their children and different ways of intervening. And finally, I would say that in particular we have to support the governance structures or the self-determination structures. The dream of the Inus is to have self-governance for their own youth protection services, and all of our studies at the moment have this aim to support this process of moving towards self-governance even for youth protection services. A final quote: contemporary realities and experiences in the past which have had repercussions on parents, children and Indigenous youth suggest that we can and we should do things better, much better, by ensuring that we set up programs, resources and services that are on a sensible footing, equivalent, efficient and sensitive to the culture of Indigenous parents. Miigwech.